A little girl suffering from a terminal illness had only one wish: to see a royal guard in real life. A simple dream, yet time waits for no one. She had fought her illness with an astonishingly resilient spirit, and today she stood here, right before the royal gates, to fulfill the greatest wish of her life. No one could have imagined that among the ranks of the royal guards, trained with unwavering discipline, there would be one who would break an unshakable rule. A man who had stood firm against rain and wind, against the scrutinizing gazes and mocking jests of tourists, against the most demanding of duties. Yet today, before an 8-year-old girl with eyes full of determination, he would do the unimaginable. And in that moment, the crowd fell silent, only to break into tears moments later. Before we continue, what do you think? Are there times when we should place humanity above the rules? What would you do if you had to choose between duty and compassion? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, at the same time, we will bring you another story, a tale of courage, honor, and soldiers who protect not only the palace but also the most beautiful aspects of humanity. The early morning sun cast its golden light over the gray stone pavements in front of Windsor Palace. Under the crisp morning glow, the royal guards stood tall, like living statues, motionless. Their polished brass buttons gleamed under the sunlight, and every detail of their deep red uniforms was flawless, without a single imperfection. Among them, William Carter, a guard who had served for over 12 years, maintained his proud stance, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He was accustomed to being a symbol of the monarchy, an immovable wall amidst the bustling crowds. But perhaps even William did not realize that today would be the day that changed his life forever. The morning sunlight bathed the gray stone walls of Windsor Castle, glistening as it reflected off the deep crimson uniforms of the royal guards. They stood in perfect rows, motionless like living statues, embodying an unbreakable discipline. Among them, William Carter held his proud stance, his deep blue eyes fixed forward, betraying not even the slightest hint of emotion. But amid the murmuring crowd of tourists, a small girl appeared. Unlike other children, she did not have soft flowing hair. Instead, a snug blue woolen hat covered her head, concealing the emptiness left by chemotherapy. Her eyes sparkled like tiny stars, filled with eagerness and admiration. She stood between her parents, her tiny hand gripping theirs tightly, as if they were her anchor. William could not move, nor could he turn his gaze toward her, but with over a decade of experience standing guard, he could sense her presence, gentle yet intense, like a small breeze that could stir an entire mountain. "Daddy, the guards are so brave, aren't they?" The girl's clear voice rang out, not loud, but enough for those nearby to hear. A few tourists turned to look at her. Some smiled, while others had their expressions soften as they recognized the reality of her condition. Jonathan, Eleanor's father, squeezed his daughter's hand gently, a tender smile forming on his lips, though there was something weighed down in his eyes. "Yes, my love. These guards are symbols of loyalty and honor. They protect the palace and uphold traditions that have lasted for hundreds of years." Eleanor beamed, but within seconds, a trace of doubt flickered across her face. But why do they not talk to anyone? Not smile? Not greet anyone? Are they not sad? Margaret, Eleanor's mother, gently rubbed her daughter's back, as if to reassure her. "Because that is the rule, my love. To be a royal guard, they must follow strict discipline." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, but her gaze remained fixed on William. But what if someone truly needed them? What if someone really wanted to be seen by them? Her innocent question caused a few people around to pause. Perhaps everyone understood the deeper meaning behind her words. Eleanor did not just want to see a royal guard. She wanted to be acknowledged. William remained still, but within his chest, something stirred. He had heard thousands of tourist conversations, had seen countless people attempt to distract him, from silly antics to outright mockery. But this time, what caught his attention was not what the girl said. It was how she said it, with such purity and sincerity that it was impossible to ignore. A soldier does not see only with his eyes. He feels with his soul. William had never imagined that one day, an 8-year-old girl would make him feel something that war, sleepless nights, and years of service had not. A hollowness, an unanswered question. Had rules ever truly mattered more than people? Can I take a picture with him? Eleanor's voice was bright, her hopeful eyes shimmering. Margaret turned to Jonathan. Both parents fell silent for a moment. They knew the rules. They knew this request might disappoint their daughter. But they also knew this could be her only chance. Jonathan took a deep breath before gently saying, "My love, the guards have a very important duty. They cannot take pictures or move while on duty." Eleanor's face fell briefly, but she remained persistent. "I will not touch him. I just want to stand a little closer." She took a step forward. Not too close, not breaking any rules, but enough to shift the atmosphere. A man in a black military uniform appeared. Sergeant Collins, William's commanding officer, stepped forward from the distance, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He had noticed the girl's movement and immediately understood what was happening. "Maintain your distance." His voice was firm, unwavering. Jonathan instantly pulled Eleanor back, and Margaret grasped her daughter's hand, as if afraid any further action would cause trouble. Eleanor lowered her head, biting her lip, but then she lifted her gaze and looked straight at William. And then she did something no one expected. Despite her small frame, despite the illness that had drained her strength, Eleanor straightened her back, placed her feet together, and let her arms rest firmly at her sides, the posture of a royal guard. No one had told her to do this. No one had taught her how to stand that way. But in that moment, she understood. If she could not come closer to the guard she admired, she would become a miniature version of him. The entire crowd fell silent. William stared straight ahead, as if he had not noticed anything. But deep inside, an overwhelming emotion swelled within him. He had seen his comrades stand like that before going into battle. He had witnessed the youngest soldier in his unit struggle to stay upright despite his wounds. And now, before him, an 8-year-old girl, frail and breathing lightly, was holding the stance of a true warrior. Not everyone is born to be a soldier, but courage belongs to anyone. William tightened his grip on his rifle. He could not move. He could not react. But for the first time in his life, he felt that discipline was becoming a chain wrapped around his heart. The atmosphere in the palace courtyard gradually became strange. Earlier, the murmurs of conversation and the cheerful laughter of tourists had echoed through the air. But now, amidst everything, only a heavy silence remained, as if even the space itself was holding its breath. At the center of attention stood a small girl, her bald head covered by a blue knit cap. Her posture was astonishingly precise, back straight, chin lifted, arms hanging at her sides, just as the royal guards had done for centuries. Eleanor was greeting death in the stance of a warrior. William Carter remained rigid, unmoving. Yet deep within his chest, his heart pounded harder than usual. He did not know what this meant to the others. But to him, a veteran who had seen his last comrades stand tall before collapsing on the battlefield, this sight was unbearable. This little girl may not have much time left. The thought lodged itself deep in William's mind like a cold blade. He had seen that look before. In field hospitals, when young soldiers realized they would not make it home, yet still smiled and asked to salute their comrades one last time. But Eleanor was not a soldier. She was just a child who should have been allowed to live. Beside Eleanor, her parents remained silent. Jonathan gazed at his daughter with an aching stare. He was a veteran. He understood the rules, understood that the guards could not react, could not show emotion. But as a father, he understood an even greater truth. This was not just a photograph. This was a moment his daughter would remember for the rest of her short life. Margaret gripped her husband's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. No words were spoken, but she knew Jonathan was fighting a battle within. Sergeant Collins was observing it all. He had stood in the military for nearly 30 years. He understood discipline. He was the embodiment of discipline. Yet, as his sharp eyes fell upon Eleanor, he saw something he had not expected, a reflection of himself from years ago. He had once had a son, a boy filled with dreams and hope. But war had stolen that away before the boy had the chance to grow up. He took a quiet, deep breath. No one noticed the way his gloved hand tightened around the holster at his hip, as if restraining an order he was not even sure he could give. And then Eleanor spoke. "Does he see me?" Her voice was small but clear as she addressed her parents. Jonathan bit his lip. Margaret looked down. No one answered. But Eleanor did not need an answer. She smiled, as if she had already found it herself. Then, in a voice frail yet full of conviction, she whispered just loud enough for William to hear. "It's okay. If he sees me, he will know that I am a warrior too." That sentence, so small yet so powerful, shattered every defense William Carter had built over 12 years of service. The crowd remained silent. A few tourists raised their hands to their mouths, too moved to speak. An elderly couple quietly wiped their tears. A tall man in a gray suit standing at the back discreetly turned away, hiding his reddened eyes. And then the unimaginable happened. William moved. At first, it was just a blink. Yet for a royal guard, even that was enough to cause a stir. Then, slowly but deliberately, his hand tightened around the stock of his rifle. In a movement entirely against protocol, William turned his head ever so slightly toward Eleanor. Just a small motion, a fleeting moment, but it carried the weight of an entire world shifting. Eleanor saw it. Her eyes widened, shimmering with light. And then, a radiant smile spread across her small face. William knew, from that moment, that there was no turning back. A whisper spread through the crowd like a ripple. He looked at her. A group of foreign tourists gasped, covering their mouths in shock. A woman placed a hand over her heart, choking back a sob. Sergeant Collins watched the scene unfold, a strange light flickering in his aged eyes. Jonathan gripped his wife's hand. Margaret wept, no longer able to hold back. Eleanor had been seen. She was not invisible, and that mattered more than any rule. But it was not over yet. William did not just turn his head. Slowly, he raised his hand in a movement he had performed thousands of times before for high-ranking officers. He lifted his hand to his temple, and then he saluted, not to the royals, not to his superiors, but to Eleanor. Eleanor's mouth fell open, her eyes shimmering, her small hand trembling. The entire palace courtyard erupted, not in chatter, not in whispers, but in emotion. A few people in the crowd broke into tears. Others placed hands over their hearts, as if they had just witnessed something sacred. But Eleanor only looked at William. She lifted her hand, trying her best to mirror the gesture with perfect form. She was no longer just a warrior. She had been saluted as a true comrade. And then, as William lowered his hand, he knew he had broken the rule. But there are moments, standing at the crossroads of duty and humanity, when a soldier must make a choice. And he did not regret it. Silence enveloped the entire palace courtyard. But it was not the cold silence of rules and discipline. It was the silence of a moment too beautiful to be broken. A moment that everyone present knew they would never forget. William Carter remained in a solemn salute. He looked straight at Eleanor, not a small, fragile girl anymore, but a true warrior. A comrade worthy of respect. But at that moment, a sharp voice rang out, cutting through the atmosphere. "Soldier Carter?" "Sergeant Collins." His call was like a blade tearing through reality. No more emotions, no more glistening eyes. Only rules remained. William lowered his hand, but he did not immediately return to his position, because he knew what was coming next. Collins strode forward, each step echoing dryly against the stone floor. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were as sharp as a blade. The crowd began to murmur. Some stepped back as if afraid they were witnessing something they should not see. Others clenched their hands together, worried for the soldier who had broken a rule upheld for hundreds of years. Jonathan instinctively pulled Eleanor closer, as if shielding his daughter from what was about to happen. Margaret held her breath. Collins stopped in front of William, his gray eyes scanning the younger soldier. For a second, no one spoke, but everyone could feel the tension in the air. Then, in a deep yet weighty voice, he asked, "Are you aware of what you just did, Carter?" William did not blink. He looked straight at his superior officer, his spine unbending, his shoulders squared. And then he answered, "Yes, sir." No justification. No apology. A short but resolute response. Collins remained silent. In his many years of service, he had seen soldiers make mistakes. He had disciplined those who lost focus. He had reprimanded those who let emotions interfere with duty. But this time, he saw no mistake. He saw a person. He saw a soldier who had chosen compassion over protocol, yet still upheld his honor and dignity. He saw a man who placed his hand over his heart instead of merely over his weapon. The crowd fell silent. Eleanor did not fully understand what was happening, but she felt the tension. She gripped her father's hand tightly, as if holding onto a sense of safety. Jonathan stared at Collins. He was a father, but he had also been a soldier. He knew that this moment was more important than anything. Margaret whispered, just softly enough for only her husband to hear, "What is he going to do?" Jonathan did not answer, because he did not know. Collins exhaled slowly. Then, deliberately, he raised his hands and removed his white gloves. A small gesture, but to those familiar with military discipline, it was not a good sign. Some tourists began pulling out their phones, ready to record what they believed would be a severe reprimand or even a public punishment. But then, the most unexpected thing happened. Collins did not shout. He did not reprimand. He took one more step forward, and then, to the absolute astonishment of everyone, he bowed his head, not too deep, but enough to show respect, enough to let everyone understand. William's actions were not a mistake. They were a moment worthy of recognition. They were a decision that anyone with a conscience would have made. A small gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman raised her hand to cover her mouth. An elderly tourist nodded slightly, as if finally realizing they had just witnessed something truly remarkable. Eleanor blinked. Then she turned to her parents, puzzled. "What just happened?" Jonathan smiled, his eyes brighter than usual. "Something wonderful, my daughter." Collins straightened. He looked at William once more, his gaze weighing something unspoken. Then, in a steady, unwavering voice, he commanded, "Return to your position." William nodded. He turned, walked back to his post, and stood tall as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew everything had changed. Eleanor remained there, gazing at the guard as if he were a hero. And to her, he truly was. Collins turned to leave, but as he passed Eleanor, he paused briefly and glanced at her. Then, in a low voice, just enough for her to hear, he said, "Little warrior, you did well today." Eleanor's mouth fell open. She could not believe her ears. Then, as if it was the most important thing she had ever done, she quickly stood even straighter, nodding solemnly, her eyes shining. William stood still, but this time, he was not just a palace guard. He was a man who had made the right choice. He was a man who had proven that discipline was important, but compassion made one truly great. He was a man who would never forget the look in Eleanor's eyes. The atmosphere in Windsor Palace's courtyard was no longer the same. It was still a bright morning, with soft golden rays lingering on the cobblestone pavement, reflecting off the polished brass buttons of the Royal Guard's uniforms. But something intangible had shifted, something that everyone here could feel, even if no one dared to put it into words. Eleanor still stood there, her small hand gently touching the medal that William had given her. It was not just an ordinary gift. It was proof, a testament that she was not merely a frail patient to be looked at with pity. She was a warrior, someone acknowledged by the strongest. She looked up at William, her eyes glistening, as if she wanted to etch the image of this guardsman into her memory forever. She said nothing, but her smile spoke volumes. Jonathan placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. "You did well, Ellie." Margaret could not hold back her tears. She quickly wiped them away, but she could not hide the overwhelming emotion. She knew that no matter what tomorrow would bring, no matter what the future held today, her daughter had experienced a moment of true significance. The crowd around them had changed as well. The tourists who had come merely to take pictures and admire the palace now stood still, as if they had just witnessed something far more important than anything they had ever seen before. Some bowed their heads, as they passed Eleanor. Others whispered to one another in hushed, reverent tones, moved, astonished, admiring. A middle-aged man in a gray suit, perhaps a businessman on his way to an important meeting, quietly removed his glasses and wiped the corner of his eye. An elderly couple held hands a little tighter, as if they had just remembered something precious that had been forgotten amidst the relentless flow of life. A group of Japanese tourists bowed deeply to Eleanor, a gesture of respect from their culture. They all understood one thing. They had not just witnessed a rule being broken. They had witnessed compassion rising above rigid laws. William Carter remained motionless. He knew that, mere minutes ago, he had broken protocol. But now, he was back in position, once again part of the Royal Guard as he had always been for years. Yet, there was one thing only he knew. His heart was no longer the same. He had once believed that discipline was everything. That duty came above all else. That emotions were an unnecessary burden for a soldier. But now, he realized that sometimes compassion is the highest duty. Perhaps he would be reprimanded. Perhaps he would be demoted, or even reassigned. But he did not regret it, because he knew that if time were to rewind, he would do the exact same thing all over again. Eleanor and her family began to leave. She took small, slow steps, but each one was firm and resolute. It was as if today's events had given her a strength she had never known before. And then, just before stepping beyond the cobblestone courtyard of the palace, Eleanor stopped. She turned around looking at William one last time. Then, with all the respect an 8-year-old could muster, she raised her hand and performed a formal royal salute. Not a child's wave, not a simple goodbye, but a true salute for a comrade. William stared straight ahead, but everyone knew that he saw her. And then, in a moment that made the entire crowd hold their breath, he saluted back. This time, not out of duty, not because of tradition, but because of an unspoken promise. As Eleanor and her parents walked away, the crowd quietly dispersed. But everyone carried something with them, a story, a lesson, a memory they would never forget. Because there are moments in life that redefine the true meaning of strength. And today, a soldier had learned that standing still is not always the ultimate symbol of resolve. Sometimes breaking the rules is what truly makes a soldier. And sometimes an 8-year-old girl can teach the entire world a lesson in courage. William Carter remained still in his position, rifle on his shoulder, eyes staring straight ahead, his body motionless like a living statue, as if the moment that had just passed had never happened. But within him, everything had changed. His gaze swept over the dispersing crowd. A few tourists still glanced back, as if trying to etch into their memory the scene they had just witnessed. Some whispered to each other, but their conversations were no longer about ordinary travels. They had seen something truly meaningful, something they might recount to their loved ones, their friends, or perhaps even their own children. Yet William paid no mind to their murmurs. He was thinking of only one thing: Eleanor. That little girl did not know she had changed him, but she had done something that no battle, no superior officer, no military training had ever been able to do. She had taught him that true strength did not lie in standing motionless in discipline. It lay in the ability to see a person beyond rigid rules. It lay in the courage to act when it truly mattered. He thought back to himself years ago, a young man stepping into the army, believing that discipline was everything. That stillness, absolute obedience to orders, was the ultimate symbol of strength. But now, after years in the military, after witnessing comrades fall, after seeing the pain war had left behind, he understood that there was something even more important than discipline: compassion. Because, in the end, we do not fight merely for a flag. We fight to protect what truly matters. And today he had protected something: a dream, a belief, a small soul, yet stronger than the soldiers who had stood beside him. Somewhere else, Eleanor was smiling. The medal still gleamed on her chest, not as a token of pity, but as proof of her strength. Today, she had not just seen the Royal Guards. She had become a part of their story. And whether her time was long or short, whether her battle had an ending she could foresee or not, she knew she had lived a moment that no one could ever take away from her. A moment when a true soldier had looked at her, not as a sick child, but as a real warrior. And what about you? What do you think true strength is? Is it always about following the rules? Or is it sometimes about daring to break them for something greater? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story has touched your heart, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and help spread this message to more people. Because true strength is not about never wavering. It is about knowing when to kneel to lift someone else up,